The Israel-Iran conflict has entered the sixth day. Thousands are fleeing Tehran after several explosions rocked the city. Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Khamenei showed defiance in a televised address. He said Iran will never surrender and warned the United States of serious consequences if it gets directly involved. This comes after President Trump demanded Iran's unconditional surrender and threatened direct U.S. strikes. Israeli Defense Forces claim to have struck factories producing centrifuges and weapons. Major explosions were reported in Tehran overnight. The extent of the damage remains unclear. Meanwhile, Iran fired a pair of ballistic missile barrages at Israel. Sirens and explosions were heard over Tel Aviv. Israel said it intercepted most of the missiles. According to a human rights agency, more than 550 people have been killed across Iran. At least 24 people have been killed in Israel. What will U.S. direct involvement mean for both the countries? Joining us now is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of the Iran Program at Foundation for Defense of Democracies. Thank you very much for being with us. Let me begin by asking you, Behnam, that Ayatollah Khamenei has said Iran is not going to accept President Trump's call for unconditional surrender. Where does this leave us in this current crisis in the Middle East?
Well, it's a pleasure to be with you. It likely means that in the short term, there may not be a diplomatic off-ramp in the making, particularly because of A, the defiance of the rhetoric of the Supreme Leader that you mentioned there, but B, the military success thus far that the Israelis are enjoying, basically picking apart large elements of the Iranian defense apparatus in the west and central parts of the country. Thus far, the Iranian main response to Israel has been surface-to-surface missile attacks. Now it looks like the regime is having to engage in those surface-to-surface missile attacks from deeper in its own territory, and Israel is still intercepting large swaths, but unfortunately not all of those. And the X factor thus far means that President Donald Trump's decision here, whether to do what he's been saying he would do and go after potentially the Supreme Leader of Iran, or, for example, one could say to enter the conflict and go after the buried subterranean nuclear facilities at Fordo, that too could be up to him, but all eyes will be on the U.S. To change this current equation.
Right. Ayatollah Khamenei has also said that in case U.S. makes a direct attack on Iran in support of Israel, there will be irreparable damage. How do you think Iran could retaliate in case the U.S. gets into this war?
Well, there were two threats that were made even before the U.S. was considering entering that had great import for the U.S. One was the decision to potentially leave the Non-Proliferation Treaty. The parliament was discussing that over the weekend, as well as comments by several other or what's left of them, senior Iranian military officials, to potentially close the Strait of Hormuz. That was up until you saw more forward-leaning rhetoric from the president. In response to that, I think Western media outlets, including the New York Times, said that Iran was, quote-unquote, preparing missiles. That probably means that they're fueling missiles, taking them out of storage. This is the shorter-range stuff that might be able to hit the constellation of U.S. bases much closer to Iranian territory, for example, just across in the Persian Gulf or in Iraq or elsewhere. So that probably might be the main threat vector that the Iranians put to the U.S. here.
Right. How do you read the presence of General Asim Munir in the United States? President Trump is going to be having lunch with the Pakistani army chief at the White House. This is unprecedented. If you look at the protocol, no president sits down with an army chief for lunch. In this current context, how do you see Pakistan being important for the U.S. because Pakistan shares a border with Iran?
Pakistan does indeed share a border with Iran, and many in the audience may not know this, but in 2024 was a historic year for Iran's ballistic missile barrages because not once, not twice, but 3 times Iran directly fired ballistic missiles as a non-nuclear country at the territory of a nuclear country. And if you may remember, January 2024 was actually at Pakistan. Pakistan also responded with a smaller barrage of its own, and both countries had called it quits. I don't think the rest of the meeting, however, meaning the potential meeting between the Pakistani general and the U.S. president, is going to necessarily be dominated by Iran, but I don't think that it also would be ignored either. I think it has much more to do with the situation around India, the politics of who mediated what when, and of course, even though it's diplomatically unprecedented and it may bend but not break the diplomatic protocols that you mentioned, there is the old saying about Pakistan being a military with a country. So in many ways, Donald Trump may be looking to bypass the civilian establishment to really see what is going on the ground there, as the U.S. has become a little bit more disinterested, shall we say, in South Asia after the 2021 Afghanistan withdrawal, unless, of course, it is seen through the prism of great power competition, which makes America a much closer partner of India, not Pakistan.
Right. I would also ask you about the possibility of a larger war in the Middle East. It seems that would become the situation in case US gets into the attack. But what's at stake for the US, and how badly do you think the US could be impacted in case there is a full-fledged war and US gets involved?
Well, if the Islamic Republic does decide to widen the war, there is no doubt that they will be able to land blows, not decisive blows, but there is no doubt that they will be able to land blows at U.S. basing and other military infrastructure much closer to Iranian territory, for the sheer fact that Iran still has large elements of its short-range ballistic missile intact. In military terms, short-range ballistic missiles are missiles that go under 1,000 kilometers. A lot of that installation is nearer to Iranian territory, and Iran's shorter-range projectiles are much more suited to be precision strike or tactical or battlefield weapons. So the chances of direct hits against those bases does unfortunately rise. However, the Iranians would be essentially taking a massive gamble here, because I could easily see the president responding directly and forcefully against Iranian territory, probably even civilian and military leadership alike in that instance, given the fact that in 2019, in the first term, Donald Trump's threshold for the use of military force in the region was the loss of American life. And given that already we're living through different gradations of a Middle East regional war since October 7, the stakes are already high.
All right. Behnam, I request you to stay on with us. President Trump has been speaking outside the White House in the last few minutes. Here's what he said on the situation in Iran.
Will you strike the Iranian nuclear component? And what time exactly, sir? Sir, would you strike it? Would you please inform us so we can be there and watch? I mean, you don't know that I'm going to even do it. You don't know. I may do it. I may not do it. I mean, nobody knows what I'm going to do. I can tell you this, that Iran's got a lot of trouble, and they want to negotiate. And I said, why didn't you negotiate with me before? All this death and destruction. Why didn't you negotiate? I said to the people, why didn't you negotiate with me 2 weeks ago? You could have done fine. You would have had a country.
All right, so that was Donald Trump. Behnam, you heard Donald Trump saying there, I'm not going to tell you when we would carry out, but I may or may not attack Iran, and Iran wants to negotiate. I told them that why didn't you start negotiating 2 weeks back? What do you think is Donald Trump's intention here? There are a lot of speculation that US and Israel both want a regime change. Can they bring this out together in Iran?
Well, before we get to the regime change question, which I think is worth exploring here, because if there is a flip in Tehran, meaning if one is able to decapitate and really flip the world's foremost state sponsor of terrorism and actually somehow find a way to empower the Iranian people, you would have a drastically different balance of power in the Middle East. And that actually might even free up U.S. assets, interest, and attention to focus on more tier one 21st century state threats, be they Russia or China. But before that, obviously, is the threat the president levied himself. And there is a certain amount of uncertainty the president has been trying to cultivate. You can even say diplomatically try to weaponize in some of the social media posts he's been giving, and as you mentioned, in some of the media statements he's been making as well. This is designed to increase the agony of decision-making, in my view, for the Iranians, but also to give the president diplomatic leverage. And I think option number one here for the president is not the military option. It's not even the regime change option. The president has been remarkably consistent, both in term one and term two, and even campaigning before term one and term two, that what he seeks is a diplomatic resolution. So even though we've been living through 5, if not 6 days of the Israeli military neutering or defanging large elements of the long-range strike capability of the Islamic Republic and doing some but not doing some damage, but not destroying all of the atomic infrastructure in that country. I think the president may look to try to build on military success towards potentially a deal. That's why there is this steady drumbeat. But if the Iranians do genuinely widen the war, or if they continue to strike civilian centers, or if somehow an American citizen is killed or is roped into this, then I think the regime might be signing its death warrant, and that would move us towards that conversation potentially about regime change without actually having a regime change policy. I mean, I'm critical of this because no doubt the U.S. did botch everything in 2003 in Iraq and much later on in Afghanistan, but Iran is not Iraq and Iran is not Afghanistan. You have at least 100 years of a population seeking representative government. And again, if you are able to flip that and empower the Iranian people, that would be a game changer. And the lack of a will to even try to think about a political plan for the day after in Tehran is what has actually impeded really critical, creative, and imaginary thinking for the U.S. And Israel here. And it's why we've been only taking a very narrow counter-proliferation view of this threat.
All right, Behnam bin Taleblu, thank you so much for joining us here on Global Lens, giving us your view on the very, very worrying situation between Israel and Iran and about the possibility of a larger war. Let's move on and